Hello, and welcome to this, the fifth seminar in our Receptions and Comparatism series. I'm Justine McConnell, and it's my pleasure this week to introduce our speakers. After last week's seminar on orality and script worlds, today we're turning to a topic that was touched upon last week, that of decolonisation. And this week, unusually, we have 4 speakers, and that's because we're lucky enough to be hearing from the team of scholars who are working on the Leverhulme-funded project Comparative Classics, Greece, Rome, India. So, as in previous weeks, I'll introduce all the speakers now so that they can just follow one on from the other without any further intervention from me. And then we'll take a 10-minute break and we'll return here for questions and discussion. So, our first speaker this week is Professor Chakravarthi Ram-Prasad, who is Distinguished Professor of Comparative Religion and Philosophy at Lancaster University, and he is also a Fellow of the British Academy. His research ranges widely across metaphysics, epistemology, and the philosophy of religion, and his publications are very extensive as well. But to name just a few of his books, he is the author of Knowledge and Liberation in Classical Indian Thought from 2001, also of Indian Philosophy and the Consequences of Knowledge from 2007, and Divine Self, Human Self from 2013. And as well as his work on the Comparative Classics project, Ram is also currently writing a book that develops a philosophical anthropology of emotion through a reading of classical Indian texts. Our next speaker will be Professor Francesca Orsini, who is Professor Emerita of Hindi and South Asian Literature at SOAS, and she is also a Fellow of the British Academy. Francesca has worked extensively on multilingualism, including leading the European Research Council funded project Multilingual Locals and Significant Geographies, which focused on 3 time periods, those of colonial consolidation, decolonisation, and the globalising moment of the present. Among other works, Francesca is the author of The Hindi Public Sphere, 1920 to 1940, Language and Literature in the Age of Nationalism, from 2002, and Print and Pleasure, Popular Literature and Entertaining Fictions in Colonial North India, from 2009. Francesca's work spans not only geographic and linguistic boundaries, but also temporal ones, with work ranging from the 15th century right up to the current era in India. Our third speaker will be Professor Phiroze Vasunia, who is Professor of Greek at UCL at University College London. His research also ranges very widely, from antiquity to the present, with a particular interest in colonialism, empire, and cross-cultural contact. That latter, the cross-cultural contact, is really at the heart of the Comparative Classics project that I just mentioned, of which Phiroze is the principal convener. Among many publications, I'll mention just a few of his books. Phiroze is the author of The Gift of the Nile, Hellenizing Egypt from Aeschylus to Alexander from 2001, and also The Classics and Colonial India from 2013, and he is co-author of the Post-Classicisms book from 2019. He's also general editor of Bloomsbury's book series Ancients and Moderns. And then we will hear from Dr. Maddalena Italia. Maddalena is a Leverhulme Research Fellow at UCL working on the Comparative Classics project. Maddalena's PhD, which she completed at SOAS in 2018, was on modern reception of Sanskrit love poetry in India and in the West. She went on to teach Sanskrit and Ancient Greek and Latin at City Lit here in London and at the British Museum, before taking up her current role at UCL. Among her publications are an article that came out last year in Comparative Critical Studies on Powys Mather's translations of Sanskrit erotic lyric poetry, and her 2018 article entitled Translation Immoral, Contamination, Hybridity and Vociferous Silences in Early 20th Century Translations of Sanskrit Erotic Poetry. So welcome all of you, and thank you so much for being here. And without further ado, I'll hand over to you.
So I'm going to begin by introducing the Comparative Classics project, and by way of saying a little bit more about its thinking, lead into what the other speakers are going to say. So in its barest outline, the Comparative Classics project looks at Greek and Latin materials on the one hand, and Sanskrit and Hindi materials on the other, primarily in India, to explore what might be thought of as the classical. Now, that barest bone outline doesn't tell you very much, and what we are intending to do in the course of this project is to be looking in quite great detail at different genres of texts and the sort of different lives they've led across the centuries. In the context of decolonization, it's worth looking at both comparative and classics. And I'm going to give two ideas about comparison and the classical, the intersections of which I think speak to the topic today about decolonization. So classics might be thought of, we're treating it as if it might be thought of in two different ways. One is what I would call the functional idea of the classical. The functional idea of the classical does not need a nomenclature attached to it. It need not necessarily mean a self-conscious articulation of the idea of the classical. Rather, it is the historical process by which particular cultural products, especially texts, come to exert a certain kind of influence in the area of their functioning linguistically and geographically. The narratives they offer tend to become reinterpreted. That is to say, new tellings derive in some way or in some form of dialogue with the original, i.e. classical materials. The classics might take a long time in emerging. They might, in fact, in some chronological sense, be distinguished between the ancient and the classical, but ancient materials might, for example, with the Upanishads in India or the Buddha's Pali canonical materials, or indeed Homer, might be distinguished from later densely woven, self-conscious, often courtly creations that are in some ways thought of as classical. But these ancient materials too, in this broader functional sense of the term, become classical because they become the origins, they become a resource for later tellings. The functional classical not only pertains to these kind of originary products, but also to a densified body of work, often occurring in courtly contexts, or at least in contexts of patronage and a systematic support for the production of knowledge that happens in various sort of areas, perhaps around temples, perhaps in courts. This sort of full-blown, the high classical, is self-conscious, often interacts very closely with other creations of that time or from the previous generations, tends to develop certain forms of presentation, whether it's on stage or in the use of a particular kind of lexicon in the language, or indeed when it comes to architectural styles or artistic styles. So the functional classical, in this sense, could be found in all kinds of civilizational contexts, in China, in Persia, in the Arabic world, in India, at different points in pre-Columbian Americas, and of course in Europe. The functional classical, therefore, is something that can be recognized in different ways. In the Indian context, for example, there is an idea of Sanskrit as the refined, as opposed to the languages called Prakrits, which might broadly be seen as vulgar or transactional. So the very idea of Sanskrit as the self-conscious language of the gods, and the different kinds of scripts which are used before Devanagari, the writing of the gods, becomes the main script, that whole process is a parallel to how the notion of the classical comes to be articulated in antiquity in Europe. So while we might not be able to find strict parallels, this emergence of the sense of a center of literary and other forms of knowledge production, which comes to have the subsequent systematic impact on later cultural products, is the functional mark of the classical. And I think anybody looking across their own areas of specialism, but also at other civilizational contexts, can deal with the classical in this functional way without asking deeper questions of comparison. However, the problematization of the notion of the classical comes with a development that we characteristically associate with the birth of modernity in early modern Europe, and especially in, for example, Britain, reaching its apogee in the 19th century and continuing to exert an influence to this very day. Here, the notion of the classical is a kind of recursive and meta-theoretical and highly self-aware process by which elites in particular societies trace a certain kind of intellectual and cultural lineage back and create a historical narrative by which the nature, the impacts, the influence, and the range of a classical past comes to be seen as directly inherited by them. For example, as Phiroze has written, the way in which the inheritance of Greece and Rome came to be taken up by the British intellectual elites at the height of the British Empire. Now, this is where, of course, the concept of the classical gets problematized. One within a particular society or a particular intellectual culture in which classicism becomes a form of hegemonic telling of a society's history, which then renders marginal various voices, voices of women, voices of working classes, and so on, but also externally, when the notion of the classical comes to be associated as with a mode of interpreting other cultures. And that's broadly what we are looking at here. We're looking at the way in which the notion of the classical comes to be identified with a particular Western European reading, which in fact often rendered silent the voices of modern Greeks, a particular Western European telling, as in Britain, in which the classical comes to be seen almost in a Hegelian way as an unfolding of history across time and the fulfillment of a particular way of thought, a particular way of cultural production, which becomes associated with one nation state. And of course, this modern classicism is intimately imbricated in the emergence of nationalisms in Europe. For example, in the fascist state of Italy in the early part of the 20th century, where there was a very deliberate way of trying to revert to a continuity with the Roman Empire. Now, this classicism has a comparative dimension. And so now we turn to the two notions of the comparative that I'd like to talk about. The first notion of the comparative is absolutely something that emerges out of this hierarchical, hegemonic, modern European notion of the classical, closely associated with colonialism, with the taxonomization of the world that we see in the latter part of the Enlightenment and so on. In this, other people's cultures, the history of their civilizations, are interpreted against the standard of this revivified European classicism. The emotional depth of literature, the intellectual rigor of thought, the creativity and coherence of architecture, all these kinds of literary elements of other societies are held up against this hegemonic and original classicism that is associated with the Western European rendering of the Greco-Roman past. In that way, Kalidasa might then be compared as a Sanskrit poet with anybody from Homer to Shakespeare. In that mode of telling, you end up having a particular kind of hierarchy of classicism. So the comparison is to fix the creative history of other cultures and other literatures in relation to Western classicism. So Sanskrit, for example, or Persian or classical Chinese and so on, are seen as in some ways paler models indigenously developed in these places, not as good as, but in some kind of lesser way, comparable to the classical West as interpreted by the modern West. So in that sense, comparative classicism is a perpetuation of a colonial model of thinking. However, we might think of comparison in a different way, in a decolonial way. Here, what we do is we shift the perspective away from the historical, this kind of political modern rendering of the classical and go back to the functional. When we go back to this functional notion of the classical, we simply say, in this time, in this space where history has already happened, we cannot forget the colonization of the classical in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, but we can shift our perspectives, go back and try and understand as best as we can the internal coherence, the creative potential, and indeed the continuing impact of the classical past in other contexts, as for example, in India. Now, sometimes this can, I think deliberately, without necessarily being nationalistic, can be a particular kind of counter-universalism of the classical. And although, of course, one must admit that in India or China today, there are certainly this kind of counter-classicism is very much a kind of the striking back of the post-colonial state. From this perspective, an attempt is made with, as I said, different kinds of political implications. An effort is made to look at the Western past from particular kinds of claims made for Indian or Chinese or other classical pasts. Now, the problem with this kind of nationalistic reading is simply that it replicates in its modes of thought what was being done in Western Europe in the 18th, 19th, or even in the 20th centuries. What it basically does is take a nation state, makes it the vehicle of a classical inheritance, and uses it to generate narratives of hegemony. So in that sense, it can be deeply suspect to engage in these forms of counter-universalism, even if a scholar might disavow the explicit political agenda. There is yet another way of doing a particular kind of decolonized comparative classicism. And I hope that that is what we are trying to aim at. And I think that is something that is happening in other comparative contexts. This is not so much a counter-universalism as a decentering of the study of the classical past. It is to be deeply textually engaged and to try and look at the coherence, the resonances, the sophisticated content of these texts from the past, and I'm talking now specifically about texts of different genres, and engage in a way of deliberately estranging oneself from presuppositions about what a classical text is, or what the point of particular narratives are, or what literary beauty is, or what philosophical novelty is, and so forth. And so you approach materials in a way that challenges that colonial hierarchical model. So, for example, as we are going to see with both Phiroze and Francesca, we're going to be looking at the life of the ancient Sanskrit Ramayana from the start of the Common Era, how it was transformed in the 16th and 17th centuries through Tulsidasa's Hindi Ramayana, and how, when we look at the life of the Hindi Ramayana and its sort of late classicism, its continuing impact on 20th and 21st century India, we start asking questions, say, about Homer, say, about other kinds of Greco-Roman or indeed Christian materials, and compare and contrast the questions that arise from looking at the Ramayana in its context, and through the lens of that kind of textual analysis, ask questions, perhaps disorienting questions, about Western literary materials that are considered classical. The way we look at comparative classicism now is not really to develop an elaborate ideological structure about the relationship between different civilizational units or different literary inheritances, but rather to engage in a careful, precise manner with the content of texts across traditions. What form of comparative classicism will emerge is probably going to be the result of a generation-long collaboration between scholars in different traditions, in different disciplines. And so the answer remains to be seen, but we are hoping that the present sensitivity to decolonization speaks well to this comparative classics project on which we have embarked.
Hello, the case I am presenting follows up on Ram's initial framing and questions, and particularly the issue of what happens when we take an Indian classic as a starting point for a comparative exercise. Do different questions come up, or a different paradigm? And the example that I'm presenting, which Phiroze will also talk about, is an early modern retelling of the Ramayana story, which became the most authoritative Ramayana in North India in the modern period, and very much sort of rose to the status of classic. So Tulsidas Hindi, or rather Avadhi Ramcharitmanas, or the Hindi Ramayana as it's called, counts as one of the many Ramayanas, so one of the many versions of the story. And the many Ramayanas paradigm by R.K. Ramanujan and Paula Richman sort of posits that every retelling, every version is sort of valid in its own right. Although in fact, in a later set of essays, Paula Richman also emphasized that the difference between the kind of more authoritative Ramayanas, or authoritative tellings, of which this would definitely be one, and instead the kind of the questioning Ramayans that tend to be sort of more challenging of some of the premises of, caste, gender, or other premises of the story. So as I say, it's already authoritative actually in the early 17th century. and even more in the kind of canonization of Hindi literature in the early 20th century, already as part of the colonial curriculum and then afterwards, and even more after the very popular late 1980s TV Ramayana, which was not exclusively but largely based on Tulsidas's classic. Tulsi's Ramayana was also one of the earliest Hindi texts to be printed in the 19th century and an enduring bestseller. So every sort of publisher basically brought out its own version. But also, and that's really important for our argument, it lives as a text, so it has a life as a text, to quote Philip Dufgendorf's wonderful study of it, in a multiplicity of form, not just as a text to be read, and certainly not just as a text to be read as literature, but also as a ritual text for daily private ritual, for massive public rituals in temples, for annual performances, sort of theatrical performances of the Ram Lila and so on. So it gets read out, sung, explained, expounded, memorized, and so on. But as I say, it also became the modern classic, the Hindi modern classic, when the Hindi school and college curriculum and literary histories were established in the colonial period. And interestingly, it was praised by colonial scholars and Indian scholars alike. In fact, most of the prose text in prose and poetry text in this reader for schools up there in the corner really relate to the Ramayana and the Mahabharata as kind of de-alienated from colonial education and culture. So Tulsidas is the first of the 9 gems of Hindi, the 9, you could say, classics of Hindi, the Hindi Navaratna, patterned on the 9 Sanskrit classics, of which Kalidasa was one, but interestingly for as much historical, cultural, and moral as aesthetic reasons. So in fact, in this book, Tulsidas is called a Mahatma, not just a Mahakavi, a great poet, but also a great soul. And just to sort of quote and paraphrase from the argument that the most influential Hindi literary critic and historian Ramchandra Shukla put forward in his book on Tulsidas, but also in his authoritative literary history, Tulsidas has this sort of crucial and central presence because, following of course on colonial historiography, at the time of despondency after the establishment of Muslim rule, and also although he's writes in the 16th century, this is viewed in the context of sort of post-Muslim invasion history after the late 12th century, the 12th century. So it's all part of that establishment of foreign rule, and the devotionalism or bhakti of Tulsidas, which unlike other devotional saint poets did not deny the Vedas or as other knowledge tradition, nor the caste system, irrorated, and I'm quoting, the withered Hindu life with the nectar of devotion and made it green again. This bhakti saved the Hindu community or jati at a time of despair. Tulsi's divine voice reached not only every home, but every Hindu heart. The Lord is not far, he's mingled with your life. And it sowed the seed of that energy, that Shakti, that power that can make community rise again. And if this is written in the 1920s, so there's a clear sort of Hindu nationalist, but certainly nationalist, patriotic overtone. And in fact, the fact that that Tulsi's Ramayana is not just a text that is read as literature or in the classroom, but has this life in the home, in the temple. So every aspect of Hindu life, Ramchandra Shukla says, appears immersed in Ram. So in fact, also the Ramcharitmanas is praised because unlike other devotional texts, it contains everything. It contains all emotions. It contains all aspects of life. Now, this championing of the devotion, the bhakti tradition, was also part of a redefinition of literature and aesthetic away from the kind of what had been considered poetry, so what we now call kind of courtly poetry, a kind of mannerist poetry, and towards a poetry of what was called lokhit, welfare of the people, that would teach the right values and emotions. And so religious devotionalism, which focuses on the emotion, becomes a kind of moral and sentimental education as well as an aesthetic one. And again, as I say, Tulsidas is the top Mahakavi, top great poet, because his Ramayana shows mastery over the whole range of human emotions. And interesting in this redefinition of, what is literature for, Ramchandra Shukla is very much in dialogue with European thinkers from Spencer to Croce. So, we could make perhaps a comparison with Dante, and of course, again, his centrality as a classic and also as a guide, but certainly, the religious, moral, emotional kind of sort of power, authority is much stronger in the case of Tulsidas. Interesting, so again, it's an authoritative Ramayana, but much more popular and accessible than Valmiki's Sanskrit text. As I say, it's part of the literary canon, but also outside of it, religious, moral, with political overtones, as well as literary. It's vouched for by colonial scholars and nationalist leaders like Gandhi, and even colonial scholars say that, it saved India, it saved Hinduism. And it has this sort of interesting status as both being very inclusive, so everybody can be saved by Ram, but also supportive of the caste system and of patriarchy. And I'll stop here.
I believe it's my turn next, and I'd like to thank David and Fiona and Justine for organizing this terrific seminar series, and thanks also to Justine for her very generous introduction. How does an epic poem remain a classic? I'll try to approach this question by exploring two epic traditions, one connected to the Aeneid by Virgil and the other associated with the Ramayana, which is said to have been composed by Valmiki. I'm not about to give you a definitive explanation of how poems maintain their classic status, but I think the subject is worth exploring even very briefly. Let's consider for a few moments the Ramcharitmanas, which is composed by Tulsidas in the 16th century and which Francesca has just been discussing. Francesca has reminded us in her work that Tulsidas himself is elevated to prominence in the 19th and early 20th centuries at a time when a wider Hindi literary community is created, and Tulsi's poem enjoys a dissemination in the Hindi public sphere. Nationalism and colonialism are important contexts for understanding the popularity of Tulsidas. It was thought that just as the poet offered an example of Hindu hope in the age of Muslim Mughal rule, so he might offer encouragement to Hindus in a period of British rule. I offer 3 or 4 observations in this rushed small literary history from Valmiki to the 20th century. First is that the broad frame of Hinduism remains vital to the success of the story of Rama, although I would immediately qualify this by noting that the Sanskrit epics are translated into Persian under Mughal patronage and then later into Urdu. Secondly, the desire to promote a certain kind of Hindi sweeps up Tulsidas in its embrace and places him at the center of the emerging Hindi movement in the 19th and early 20th century, though again, the stories of Rama are told in numerous Indian and non-Indian languages. Third, the context of foreign rule, whether Mughal or British, is regularly invoked as a crisis to which the story of Rama can respond. The poet Nirala, for example, wrote a long poem on Tulsidas in 1934, which itself is now regarded as a classic of modern Hindi literature, and which responded to the pressures of foreign domination in an innovative way. Fourth, The story of Rama continues to circulate in India in various tellings, 300 or 3000, no one really can say, and marks an important difference with the story of Aeneas that is celebrated by Virgil in his epic poem. Scarcely any person today relates to the stories of Aeneas in the ways that many people continue to relate to the story of Rama and Sita. The absence of a living tradition into our own time means that the reception of the Aeneid is less dense, less emotive, and less resonant than the reception of the Ramayana. The fortunes of the Aeneid are, of course, intertwined with Christianity, and the literary history of Latin and many European languages would read very differently if the two had not intersected. Passing over Augustine, Dante, and Milton, let me arrive directly at the second half of the 19th century, when Aeneas is read as a Christ-like figure. Tennyson's Idylls of the King draws its inspiration from the Aeneid, as well as from Arthurian legends, which in turn are infused with Christian sentiment. Victorian commentators in England compare Aeneas to Christ. The actions of one found the city of Rome, the actions of the other make it the everlasting city of God on earth. In Britain, at least, Christianizing readings of the Aeneid flourish well into the later years of the 19th century. At roughly the same time that Tulsidas was being embraced and canonized by Hindi speakers in South Asia, British administrators in the same parts of India were quoting lines of Virgil in their letters, reports, and dispatches. Jupiter's words to Venus in Book 1 and Anchises' remarks to Aeneas in Book 6 were especially popular with these writers, and one can understand why, since at least at a surface level they refer to the future greatness of Rome. By this time, generations of readers in Britain regarded the Roman Empire as a model both positive and negative for the British Empire. Triumphant or optimistic readings of the Aeneid, which suggest that Virgil is largely sympathetic to Aeneas and his mission, find a resonant context in imperial Britain. Many colonialist readers look up to Virgil for presenting Aeneas as a supporter of Rome's imperial destiny, though it is also true that many others criticize him for drawing Aeneas in this light. Now, it would be overly facile to suggest that the Aeneid was popular in Britain or among British readers only because of colonialism and nationalism, or that the poem is only about colonialism and nationalism, or that its presence today in the university syllabus is a colonial hangover. No, epic traditions are resilient and find old and new meanings as their readerships evolve. The Aeneid is still a popular poem among school and university students in Western Europe and the USA, but it doesn't quite have the same place in national conversations as it once did. And this is true even in the USA, where a line from Virgil appears on the 9/11 memorial. But the erosion of God and empire have opened up new ways of reading the epic in a secular, perhaps more cosmopolitan world. With the story of Rama, a thread connects the revival of Tulsidas to the popularity of the stories of Rama in the 20th century, to the spectacular success of a television series based on the Ramayana in the 1980s, to the Hindu fundamentalist revival in India at the present time. I don't think religion is the only explanation for the continued hold of the Ramayana in its many versions. To quote A.K. Ramanujan, in India and in Southeast Asia, no one ever reads the Ramayana or the Mahabharata for the first time. The stories are there, always, already. Those who tell and retell these stories are of many persuasions. And this seems a good point for me to stop and to hand over the microphone, so to speak, to Maddalena.
My presentation will zoom in on the comparative component of our Comparative Classics project, looking at the genealogy of the practice of creating intertextual connections between classical as well as non-canonical texts in modern commentaries on Sanskrit poetry. What kind of knowledge does a comparative commentary produce? What kind of oriental texts are quoted in modern comparative commentaries? And finally, why should a commentary need to mobilize a vast archive of more and less familiar texts to allow the modern reader to appreciate Sanskrit erotic poetry? In her monograph, Le Livre de l'Inde, The Books of India, 2014, Claudine Leblanc comments on the attempts to familiarize a 19th century French audience with Sanskrit literature. Such a process of familiarization was carried out through endless comparisons. Quote, compared in turn to 17th century literature of the Préciosité style, to Greek bucolic poetry, to medieval legend, to Greek tragedy, and finally to opera, the Sanskrit piece ultimately resembles a chimera, familiar in places, in a close-up and cumulative view, but when taken as a whole, foreign to both the reader and to the work it is compared to, unquote. This chimera is the paradoxical outcome of the process of comparison, which 19th century scholars, in a not dissimilar way from their 21st century counterparts, treated as an essential tool of acclimatization. However, one that could hardly avoid producing a hierarchy between the cultures that were being compared. What is more, quoting from Didier Cos's review of Le Livre de l'Inde, in 19th century France, quote, any reading of what is new is only possible by reference to the archive of previous readings. Indian books have the right to a relative, i.e. dependent, not absolute existence. They should not merge into a universal literary field where the culture of the comparatist would also be drowned and appear as undifferentiated, nor should they develop a personality so strong that it would disrupt the comparatist epistemology or stand out to the point of remaining definitively untranslatable, illegible. The first text I shall introduce is the pioneering Anthologie érotique d'Amaru, Amaru's erotic anthology, published in Paris in 1831. The anthology contains a selection of 51 stanzas in Sanskrit, critically edited and translated into French by Antoine Léonard Chézy. From 1815 to his death in 1832, Chézy held a chair in Sanskrit at the Collège de France, the first to be created in Europe. He was the author of translations from the Persian and the Sanskrit. 1 year after the publication of his famous French translation of the Sanskrit drama Shakuntala, 1830, he published the Anthologie érotique under a pseudonym, Apudi. The Sanskrit text and the French translation of the 51 stanzas is followed by a 33-page long commentary, more precisely, notes and chosen glosses. In his notes, Chézy quotes long excerpts from Ravichandra's Sanskrit commentary, but he also comments on the stanzas and occasionally quotes parallel passages from other poetic traditions, either to clarify the meaning of a Sanskrit verse or simply to share with his readers a literary free association suggested to him by the Sanskrit text. These facing pages present the reader with a rich and diverse fare. A note on the Sanskrit poem Ramayana by Valmiki, who is compared to Homer. A fragment traditionally ascribed to Sappho, first presented in the Greek original, then translated into Sanskrit, and finally into French. The section that immediately follows includes a selection of verses in Persian, which Chézy translates into French. On this slide, you can see more clearly the trajectory followed by Chézy. The first half of the 19th century saw the publication of numerous Latin translations of Sanskrit works. Here instead, it is a Greek poem to be translated into Sanskrit. It is perhaps pointless to speculate on Chézy's agenda. Is he attempting to decenter the classical Greek tradition by granting a Sanskrit voice to one of its most famous poets? Is he effectively showing off his mastery of both classical Greek and Sanskrit in a gesture of philological hubris? What I find particularly intriguing is that the French version of the stanza is not based on the Greek original, but is in fact a rather loose translation of the new original, a Sanskritized Sappho. As we move on to the Persian section of this note, we may wonder why Chézy chose to include these previously unpublished stanzas, along with his French translation, in a commentary on Sanskrit poetry. Is this simply a form of self-promotion, or rather of self-portrayal as a multilingual Orientalist? Regardless of his intentions, what Chézy achieves in this and similar notes is the projection of a selective cosmopolitanism. His notes map the Orientalist's idiosyncratic Orient, which embraces and almost blurs the boundaries between Sanskrit and Persian. We now turn to a rather recent anthology of Sanskrit erotic stanzas translated into English. The editor and translator, Rajagopal Parthasarathi, born in Tamil Nadu, is Professor Emeritus of English at Skidmore College in the state of New York. He is the author of the first translation into modern English verse of The Tale of an Anklet, a 5th century Tamil epic poem. The anthology of erotic poems from the Sanskrit was published in 2017 by Columbia University Press. Parthasarathis translations are followed by 25 pages of notes on the poems. These include information about material and religious cultures of South Asia, as well as frequent quotations from a wide variety of sources, parallel passages from other Sanskrit works, but also verses by Belgian, Italian, Roman, Irish, American, English, Indo-Persian, Telugu, Tamil, Russian, Afghan, Maithil, and Chinese poets. Here we can see on facing pages the English translation of a Latin poem by Catullus, juxtaposed to 4 lines by the Irish poets Yeats. As was the case for Chézy's notes, the quotations have been selected as showing some thematic similarity with the Sanskrit stanza to which the note is dedicated. The note on the Sanskrit stanza, titled by the translator The Scholar's Life, comes full circle as the Yeats lines are followed by a reference to a poem by the Sanskrit author Magha, also translated in the anthology. Another pair of facing pages bear, juxtaposed, a quotation from the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphoses, translated into English, and 4 lines by the poet Ghalib, translated into English from the Persian. The note on the Sanskrit poem The Poet Speaks to the King contains also reference to another Roman poet, Horace, as well as a quotation from a sonnet by Shakespeare. The linguistic polyphony mediated by English is impressive and appears to create an ever-expanding poetic intertext. However, the criteria of selection of these parallel passages are necessarily idiosyncratic and reflect the archive of previous readings of the translator rather than that of the projected readership. I would expect a more explicit reflection on the kind of knowledge that is produced by juxtaposing excerpts from different literary and linguistic traditions under the pretext of familiarizing or defamiliarizing a Sanskrit poem. Which brings me to ask myself, and of course all of you, how and to which extent our mode or modes of reading Sanskrit poetry comparatively have changed over the last 2 centuries, if they have changed at all, and how we can escape the chimera trap evoked by Claudine Leblanc. This is the last excerpt from Parthasarathis commentary that I'm going to show you. A quotation attributed to Napoleon is preceded by a 5-line stanza in English by the English poet and Orientalist translator Edward Powys Mathers. The 5 lines are described as a translation from the Pashto of the Afghan poet Mirza Rahkhan Khalil. This is in fact a second-hand translation based on a French version included in Adolphe Talasso's Anthologie de l'amour asiatique, 1906, one of the primary sources of Powys Mathers' anthology Colored Stars, 1918, which, we must bear in mind, contains numerous pseudo-translations with no Oriental source. I'm really intrigued by the inclusion in a contemporary commentary on Sanskrit poetry of such a text as Powys Mathers' translation, which sounds a bit like a poetic relic from an early 20th century fascination with Eastern love poetry. If new commentaries are meant to create new archives of future previous readings, I believe that a reliance on second-hand versions by self-defined translators of Asiatic or Eastern poetry is indeed problematic, or rather, the inclusion of these versions needs to be problematized, for example, by expanding on the historical context that saw their production and success. Instead of conclusions, I present you with some questions about the role of the commentary in relation to the modern reader, the overarching being still, what kind of knowledge does a comparative commentary produce? First, why should a commentary need to mobilize such a vast archive of more and less familiar texts to allow the modern reader to appreciate Sanskrit erotic poetry? And are multilingual inclusiveness and literary cosmopolitanism values in themselves? I believe not. What kind of Oriental texts are quoted in modern comparative commentaries? I think that more thought should go into selecting parallel passages that are meant to represent the literary unfamiliar. Moreover, the heuristic significance of their presence in the commentary should be more clearly stated. Ultimately, these questions have to do with the intellectual genealogy of comparative commentaries and with a more critical assessment of the extent to which these comparative practices are a legacy of 19th century Orientalism. An antidote to the pitfalls of these comparative practices would be, I believe, a more self-reflexive attitude on the part of comparatives with respect to their agendas. Borrowing Sheldon Pollock's words, I quote, "A truly critical philology must acknowledge the claims the past is making upon us, making us thereby attend to it. But it must do so with self-awareness. A double historicization is required, that of the philologist, and we philologists historicize ourselves as rarely as physicians heal themselves, no less than that of the text." The philologist described by Sheldon Pollock in his essay Future Philology is not to be narrowly intended as a linguist. The author of a comparative commentary would definitely count as a philologist. I shall conclude with a couple of final questions on the future of the comparative commentary. Are there or will there be commentaries on Sappho's fragments that will include quotes from Amaru's anthology? Finally, in a globalized world where Sappho, Catullus, and Horace are not necessarily more familiar to the reader than Amaru or Ghalib, what would a comparative commentary look like? Would it rely on shared archives of previous readings, or would it rather aim at creating new ones? And according to which criteria? Thank you.